Imagine opening your eyes not to the familiar glow of an alarm clock or the comfort of a mattress, but to the hard, uneven surface of a straw-filled sack stuffed into a wooden frame that passes for a bed. In ancient Greece, most ordinary people slept on pallets or benches padded with straw, reeds, or wool if they were lucky. The wealthy might have mattresses stuffed with feathers or seaweed, but the average citizen woke with a stiff back and a body that had already endured the hardness of everyday life. There was no duvet to pull around your shoulders, only a simple woolen blanket, scratchy and often infested with lice. And there was no coffee waiting for you, no morning tea to stir the senses. Your day would begin with the sound of animals in the courtyard, the clucking of hens, or the bray of a donkey being fed. The streets outside were not paved with silence. Instead, they were alive with the uneven sounds of footsteps on dusty ground, vendors stirring before dawn, and the faint echo of voices preparing for another long day. For most Greeks, there was no luxury of sleeping in. The sun dictated your schedule. As the first light crept across the sky, life began. You had no curtains to block out the morning brightness. The rooster crowed, and that was your alarm clock. If you were a man of Athens, your day began not with leisure, but with duty. You were expected to perform physical exercise, often in the open-air gymnasia. The gymnasium was not a room filled with machines and music, but rather a simple space where men stretched, ran, and wrestled in preparation not only for health, but also for war. Citizenship in Athens required fitness, because every man could be called upon to defend the polis. You might rub olive oil into your skin to soften the dryness caused by constant exposure to the sun. But you would also cover yourself in dust afterward, as this was considered both practical and modest. It was a strange mixture of care and grime, leaving your body with a sticky, sandy texture that clung to your pores. If you were a woman, however, your day looked entirely different. Your responsibilities began immediately upon waking. A woman's life in ancient Greece revolved around the oikos, the household. Your tasks were endless and repetitive, spinning wool, weaving, preparing food, and supervising slaves, if your family owned any. Unlike the men who moved freely in public, women were expected to remain within the walls of the home. Privacy, as we think of it today, did not exist. You lived constantly in the company of others, and your life was structured by the needs of the family. Breakfast, if you can call it that, was far from indulgent. You might eat barley bread dipped in wine, or perhaps figs if they were in season. Honey, while available, was expensive and not something you would enjoy daily. Meat was rare, saved for festivals and sacrifices, meaning that most of your diet was vegetarian by necessity, not choice. Barley was the staple, ground into flour and baked into bread that was hard and filling but bland. Olive oil was precious, not poured freely over food but measured carefully, used sparingly for both cooking and lighting lamps at night. Water was fetched from a fountain house or well, often carried long distances in heavy clay vessels. The work of hauling water fell to women and slaves, and it was a burden you could not escape. The containers themselves were heavy even before they were filled, and carrying them across uneven ground was exhausting. Yet this was done daily, multiple times, without complaint because water was life, and there was no turning a faucet to make it appear. Bathing was not a daily ritual of comfort. Instead, it was a rare event, done in public baths or by splashing cold water over your body. Soap, as we know, it was not used. Instead, people rubbed oil into their skin and then scraped it off with a strigil, removing dirt and sweat along with the oil. The result was cleaner skin, but it was not a luxurious experience. Imagine standing outside, exposed to the elements, scraping grime from your body with a curved piece of bronze. There was no scented shampoo, no soft towel, only the scratch of linen cloth or animal skin to dry yourself. Clothing was simple. A chiton, a rectangular piece of cloth fastened with pins or sewn at the shoulders and belted at the waist. For men, it was knee length. For women, full length. Wool was common, linen rarer, and dyes were expensive, meaning most clothing was plain. You wore the same garment again and again, repaired it when it tore, and rarely had more than a few pieces to your name. Shoes were minimal, often just sandals, and many went barefoot. As the day stretched on, work never really ended. If you were a craftsman, you would spend your hours bent over a bench, shaping wood, clay, or metal. If you were a farmer, you would toil in the fields under the hot Mediterranean sun, tending to olives, grapes, or grain. Farming was backbreaking, with wooden plows pulled by oxen, irrigation by hand, and harvests dependent entirely on the weather. Too much rain or too little could mean famine. The monotony of planting, weeding, and harvesting filled your life with repetitive labor that could never be escaped. And if you think you might have had a moment of quiet, consider the noise of the city. Athens was not silent. Streets were crowded with people, animals, and carts. Vendors shouted, dogs barked, children played, and arguments erupted constantly. The agora, the marketplace, was the beating heart of the city, filled with merchants selling goods and philosophers debating ideas. But for most, it was not a place of learning or discovery. It was where you bartered for fish, inspected grain, or tried to avoid being cheated by a clever trader. Money was scarce. Coins were heavy, made of bronze, silver, or gold, and their value shifted constantly depending on the economy of the polis. For many people, barter was more common than currency. You might trade wool for grain, or olives for pottery. Every exchange took time, and every transaction required haggling. Nothing came easily, nothing was fast. Religion was everywhere. The gods were not distant. They were woven into daily life. Every action required some acknowledgement of divine presence. Before meals, you poured a libation of wine. Before a journey, you prayed for safe passage. Temples dominated the skyline, but sacrifices, usually of animals, took place regularly, filling the air with the smell of burning flesh. It was not an extraordinary event, but part of the rhythm of life. The gods had to be appeased constantly, and their displeasure was blamed for everything from illness to bad weather. The heat of midday often forced people to rest, but not in comfort. Homes were dark, built with small windows to keep out the sun. Walls were made of mud brick, floors of packed earth. Furniture was minimal, a few stools, a table, perhaps a couch for reclining at meals if you were fortunate. There were no soft chairs, no carpets, no glass windows to let in light. Life inside the home was dim, smoky from oil lamps, and filled with the smell of cooking, sweat, and animals. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was eaten late, after sunset. Men reclined on couches if they were wealthy. Women and slaves served them, and food was simple: bread, porridge, vegetables, olives, cheese, and occasionally fish. Wine was always mixed with water, never drunk straight, as drinking it undiluted was considered barbaric. Meat, again, was rare. If you lived in the countryside, you might have more access to goat or pork, but city life meant limited variety. The monotony of the diet was broken only by seasonal fruits or the occasional festival. After eating, conversation or entertainment might follow, but it was nothing like modern leisure. Storytelling, music from a lyre, or philosophical debate filled the hours before bed. Children were expected to listen, not speak. Women were expected to remain quiet, serving rather than participating. When the day ended, darkness returned quickly. There was no electricity, only oil lamps with limited fuel. The world beyond the doorway was dangerous at night, filled with thieves, stray dogs, and shadows. You went to bed early because there was little reason to stay awake. You lay down again on your straw mat, the day's exhaustion pressing into your bones, and you prepared to repeat the cycle tomorrow. This was life in ancient Greece, not the dramatic battles or the lofty speeches remembered in history books, but the ordinary, grinding reality of survival. Every task required labor, every comfort was scarce, and every moment was ruled by the demands of nature and the gods. And yet, despite the hardship, this was the foundation of a civilization that gave birth to philosophy, theater, democracy, and art. The contradiction is striking. How could such brilliance rise from such drudgery? By now, you've survived the long morning of chores, the stiff bed, the bland food, the heavy water jars, and the endless routine of daily life in ancient Greece. But if you thought that was enough, you'd be mistaken. Ordinary existence wasn't just about tending to the household or farming the land. It was also about being part of the polis, the city, state, that structured every aspect of Greek identity. And here, things became even more exhausting. Because to be Greek was not only to eat barley bread and toil in the fields, it was also to be a citizen, and citizenship came with expectations you might find impossible to bear. If you were a free man in Athens, you were expected to be involved in politics. Not in the sense of voting once every few years, but in the sense of constant, direct participation. Democracy in Athens was not representative. It was hands-on. The assembly, or ecclesia, met as often as 40 times a year. And attendance was not optional if you wanted to maintain your status as a good citizen. Imagine this. After a morning in the fields or at your trade, you would gather with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of other citizens on the Phoenix Hill, where the assembly met in the open air. The sun beat down on you, the air was dusty, and you had to stand for hours while speeches were given. You listened to men debate taxes, war, treaties, and the management of the city's resources. The speeches weren't short either. Rhetoric was an art, and speakers used every flourish, every pause, every lengthy argument to persuade the crowd. You might be there from morning until afternoon, straining to hear voices over the murmur of thousands. And you couldn't simply leave when bored. Participation mattered. You raised your hand to vote, adding your weight to decisions that could send men to war or decide the fate of exiles. To be absent repeatedly risked social shame and even fines. Citizenship wasn't a privilege you could take lightly. It was a duty that demanded both your time and your presence. This direct democracy sounds empowering to us today, but to the ordinary citizen, it was often another layer of obligation on top of daily survival. You couldn't escape the politics of the polis, and the polis couldn't escape relying on you. Politics was only half of your civic burden. The other half was war. Every able-bodied man was also a soldier. From the age of 18, you underwent military training, learning to fight as a hoplite, the heavy infantry soldier that formed the backbone of Greek armies. Unlike professional soldiers in later eras, hoplites were citizens first, warriors second. This meant that in addition to your daily chores and civic duties, you had to be ready to march to battle when called. The equipment alone was exhausting. A hoplite's armor included a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves for the legs, and a large circular shield called a hoplon. Together, this could weigh up to 30 kilograms. Add to this a long spear and a short sword, and you were carrying the burden of survival on your shoulders. Training required stamina, strength, and endurance. The phalanx formation rows of men standing shoulder to shoulder. Shields overlapping demanded discipline and coordination. A single slip could mean disaster for your comrades, and when war came, it was brutal not just in combat, but in logistics. Marching long distances in the heat, sleeping on the ground, eating rations of bread and dried fish, carrying heavy armor across mountains, this was as much a test of endurance as of courage. Ancient wars were often seasonal, waged after the harvest, so you fought not as a professional soldier, but as a farmer who had to return to your crops afterward. The exhaustion of war was doubled by the exhaustion of knowing life at home was waiting for you once the campaign ended. For the ordinary man, war was not glorious. It was sweaty, painful, monotonous, and terrifying, and yet it was considered a fundamental part of what it meant to be a citizen. To refuse was to abandon your duty to the polis. Religion, too, demanded constant attention, both privately and publicly. Greek life was filled with rituals, sacrifices, and festivals not as occasional events, but as a near-constant presence. At home, you poured libations of wine before meals. At the city level, grand festivals like the Panathenaea in Athens required your participation. These events involved processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies that lasted for days. Even if you weren't wealthy enough to sponsor or lead a procession, you were still expected to attend. Sacrifices were not rare, symbolic events. They happened often, requiring animals, priests, and large gatherings. The smell of burning flesh and the sound of bleeding animals were regular parts of civic life. It wasn't a private act of faith. It was a public declaration of loyalty to the gods and to the polis. These rituals were exhausting in their frequency and their demands. They consumed time, resources, and energy, and yet they were considered essential. To neglect them was to risk divine anger, not just for yourself, but for the entire community. In a world where drought, famine, and disease were constant threats, no one dared to offend the gods. While men bore the burden of politics and war, women carried the hidden burden of maintaining the household, and their duties were no less relentless. A Greek woman was expected to run the oikos efficiently. This meant overseeing slaves, if the family owned them, or doing all the work herself if they didn't. Spinning wool was one of the most constant tasks. Day after day, women spun and wove, producing the fabric that clothed the family. Weaving wasn't just a chore, it was a symbol of virtue, patience, and femininity. Yet in reality, it was endless, repetitive work that consumed hours each day. Food preparation also fell to women. Grinding grain by hand on a stone mill was labor, intensive, taking hours to produce enough flour for bread. Meals were simple but time-consuming. Bread had to be baked daily, vegetables cleaned and cooked, and water fetched. With no refrigeration, food had to be prepared fresh each day. Rearing was equally demanding. Infant mortality was high, meaning constant vigilance was required. Women had to nurse, clean, and protect their children while also managing the household. They were rarely seen in public, their lives confined to private spaces, yet their labor was the invisible foundation of Greek society. Without their work, the polis could not function. Beneath both men and women, however, were the slaves, the silent workforce of Greece. Slavery was not a marginal institution, it was central. In Athens, it is estimated that slaves made up nearly 1/3 of the population. Slaves performed much of the hardest labor, mining silver in dangerous conditions, tending fields, carrying water, cleaning homes, and assisting with every chore imaginable. They had no rights, no freedom, and their exhaustion was constant. Life for a slave in a mine was brutally short, often ending after only a few years of grueling work underground. Domestic slaves lived longer but endured endless toil. For free citizens, the presence of slaves made life marginally easier, but it also meant constant oversight. A household with slaves required management, discipline, and control. The free man's leisure was built on the exhaustion of others. What becomes clear is that life in ancient Greece was not just about individual survival, but about fulfilling the endless demands of the community. The polis shaped everything: your work, your duties, your religion, your family structure. It was a world without privacy, without escape, and without rest. Every moment of your day was bound to obligation to the city, to the gods, to your family, and to survival itself. For us today, the idea of not lasting a day in ancient Greece isn't just about the lack of modern comfort, it's about the sheer weight of expectation. To live in Athens was to carry the responsibility of being a farmer, a soldier, a citizen, a worshiper, and a family member all at once. But what happened when disaster struck, when plague, war, or famine tore through this delicate balance of duty and survival? How did ordinary Greeks endure when the already exhausting routine of life collapsed into chaos? Life in ancient Greece was already an endless pattern of duty and exhaustion, but when disaster struck, those patterns were pushed beyond breaking. The balance that held the polis together, the routines of farming, politics, religion, and family, could unravel quickly in the face of war, famine, or disease. And when it did, survival became even harder than before. Take, for example, the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. For nearly 3 decades, the Greek world was consumed by conflict. Ordinary citizens who were already juggling farming and civic duties now faced constant military campaigns, sieges, and shortages. Farmers were forced to abandon their fields as Spartan armies raided the countryside, retreating behind the walls of Athens for protection. This sudden concentration of people in the city turned daily life into something even more unbearable. Imagine thousands of citizens crammed into cramped quarters without enough food, without proper sanitation, and without the open spaces of the countryside. What had been uncomfortable before now became suffocating. And it was in this environment that plague struck. The great Athenian plague of 430 BC killed tens of thousands, perhaps even 1/3 of the population. Thucydides, who lived through it, described the symptoms in grim detail: fevers, sores, unquenchable thirst, vomiting, and a relentless spread from house to house. Doctors could not cure it, priests could not stop it, and families often abandoned their sick out of fear. For the ordinary citizen, the exhaustion of daily life now gave way to something worse: despair. Bodies piled up in the streets, and traditional funeral rites were abandoned because there was no time, no space, and no strength left to carry them out. Religion, which had once offered structure and reassurance, now seemed powerless. Many began to doubt the gods entirely. If sacrifices no longer brought protection, if prayers no longer worked, then what was left but survival at its most basic? In this way, the plague did not just destroy lives, it destroyed trust in the very systems that made Greek society function. Famine was another constant threat. A poor harvest could mean hunger for months, sometimes years. Without modern storage or transport, food scarcity was felt immediately and brutally. Bread shrank in size, rations were cut, and the poorest often starved. Families might water down their wine even more, stretch barley into thin gruel, or go without entirely. Hunger weakened the body, made labor harder, and made the routines of citizenship nearly impossible to sustain. You could not march as a hoplite, sit for hours in the assembly, or weave endlessly at the loom if you were faint from lack of food. And then there was the reality of war itself. Battles were terrifying, but even when they ended, the scars lingered. Returning soldiers often brought injuries, both visible and invisible. A man who lost his shield arm could no longer fight or farm. A father killed in battle left a widow to run the household alone in a society that gave women few rights. Slaves, seeing opportunity in chaos, sometimes revolted, adding yet another layer of instability. For women, disasters made their invisible burdens even heavier. If men were killed or absent in war, women became the silent keepers of survival, managing what little food was available, raising children alone, and holding households together in the face of fear. Their labor increased, their freedom did not. They bore the weight of survival without recognition, and yet, despite all of this plague, famine, war, poverty, Greek society endured. Cities rebuilt, fields were replanted, temples restored. Even as individuals collapsed under the exhaustion of daily life, the polis found ways to continue. That is perhaps the most striking truth about ancient Greece. It was not comfort, but resilience, that defined it. The very monotony that seems unbearable to us, the daily grind of chores, duties, and obligations, was the glue that held their civilization together. It gave them continuity in the face of chaos. For the modern listener, it is tempting to imagine that the brilliance of Greek philosophy, art, and democracy came from moments of leisure and inspiration. But in reality, it came from the endurance of ordinary people who lived lives of repetition, struggle, and survival. The ideas that shaped the Western world were built on the backs of those who fetched water every morning, who wove cloth in silence, who marched in dusty phalanxes, and who endured without complaint. Would you last a day in ancient Greece? Perhaps not. The hardness of their beds, the blandness of their food, the constant demands of politics and religion, the weight of armor, and the absence of comfort would drive most of us to despair within hours. But the Greeks did not simply last a day, they lasted centuries, through war, disease, and hunger. And from their exhaustion came endurance, and from their endurance came a civilization that continues to echo through history. The question, then, is not whether you could survive their world. It is whether our world, with all its conveniences, could endure the same tests of resilience. Would modern society, with its comforts and distractions, withstand plague, famine, and endless obligation as they did? Or have we lost the ability to endure the boring, grinding necessities that once defined survival? Tonight, we travel back through time, not to the great courts of kings or the clash of steel on battlefields, but to something much quieter, much stranger, and in its own way, much more human. We're going to explore how people in the Middle Ages sought to change their minds, to soften their senses, to drift away from pain, and yes, sometimes to get just a little high. You see, history is not always about wars and crowns. It's also about the ordinary, the intimate, the curious habits of people who lived centuries ago. When we slow down enough to listen, we realize they were not so different from us. They carried burdens, they sought relief, they craved escape, and they experimented with the world around them to find it. So, settle into your pillow, breathe deeply, and let's step into the flickering candlelight of medieval Europe, where remedies, rituals, and strange little plants waited in the corners of apothecary shops and monastery gardens. Imagine you're walking down a narrow cobblestone street in a medieval town. The air smells of wood smoke, damp stone, and roasted barley bread from a baker's oven. It's evening. The shops are closing, shutters creaking as they're drawn against the chill. But if you follow a certain alley, quieter and darker than the rest, you'll find a crooked wooden sign swinging gently in the wind. The painted letters are worn, almost unreadable, but if you step inside, you'd enter the world of the medieval apothecary. Inside, shelves bow beneath jars of powders and roots, bundles of herbs tied with twine, flasks of cloudy liquid. Beeswax candles drip steadily, their scent mixing with the sharper smells of dried sage, fennel, and bitter wormwood. A small fire crackles in the hearth, keeping the room just warm enough for the apprentice grinding seeds in a mortar. The master apothecary, hunched and gray-haired, arranges his wares, remedies for fevers, concoctions for childbirth, salves for wounds. And tucked discreetly among them, those special mixtures meant not just to heal, but to alter the mind. One of the most famous and feared was the mandrake root. The mandrake was unlike any other plant. Its root often forked into shapes that resembled tiny human figures, twisted and gnarled, as if nature itself had carved dolls from the earth. Medieval people believed these roots were powerful, even magical. Some said that when the mandrake was pulled from the ground, it let out a scream so terrible that it could kill anyone who heard it. To harvest it safely, one was advised to tie the root to a dog, then lure the animal away so that the dog pulled the root free, sacrificing itself to the mandrake's cry. Of course, much of that was myth. But the effects of the mandrake were very real. Boiled in wine, its extracts could dull pain, bring on sleep, or plunge the mind into wild hallucinations. Surgeons sometimes used it as an anesthetic before cutting into flesh. Others used it in smaller doses to chase visions, to feel that dreamy floating sensation on long winter nights. For some, the mandrake was a doorway to dreams, to prophecy, to the other world. But it wasn't just mandrake. In a world without modern medicine, people turned to herbs that both soothed and intoxicated. Henbane, for example, with its small yellow flowers, streaked with purple veins, was a plant both feared and sought after. Too much of it, and it could paralyze or kill, but in small amounts, it was said to cause a strange, drunken euphoria. Mixed into beer or wine, it made the world spin faster, colors shimmer brighter, thoughts scatter into laughter or fear. It was the buzz of the medieval tavern, though few dared to use it often. And then there was opium. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, opium had made its way along trade routes from the East. Physicians used it to ease pain and quiet coughing fits. But its dreamy, drowsy effects also became known outside of medicine. Imagine a weary traveler, after days on the road, being offered a draught laced with poppy extract. His body would sink into calm, his mind would drift, and for a few hours at least, he'd escape the dust and hardship of medieval life. Of course, not every intoxicant was so exotic. Some were right in the village garden. Nutmeg, for example, was considered a luxury spice, expensive, precious, but in larger amounts than you'd sprinkle on a pudding. Nutmeg can cause a kind of delirium, a strange and not always pleasant high. Medieval recipes warned about it, even as wealthy lords sometimes experimented for amusement at feasts. And then there was good old alcohol. Ale was the daily drink of peasants, safer than water, filling enough to serve as food. But it wasn't always mild. In monasteries and noble halls, stronger brews and wines were crafted, and evenings often ended in laughter, singing, and the unsteady staggering of those who'd had a little too much. In truth, alcohol was the most common drug of the Middle Ages, cheap, available, and dependable. But beyond the taverns there were rituals. Picture a monastery at night, its stone walls silent except for the scratching of quills and the soft chanting of prayers. In the infirmary garden, rows of herbs grow under the moonlight, valerian to calm nerves, lavender to ease the mind, cannabis for rope making, but also for its subtle effects when brewed in teas. Monks, ever the keepers of knowledge, experimented carefully. Some claimed certain herbs opened the mind to divine visions, helping them meditate longer, dream deeper, even hear the whispers of angels. And out in the countryside, village wise, women often called witches by suspicious neighbors, kept their own bundles of herbs hanging from cottage rafters. They knew how to mix henbane with belladonna, how to prepare ointments that, when rubbed on the skin, gave the sensation of flying. Did they really fly? Likely not. But the hallucinations were strong, and many a frightened villager swore they had seen a witch soaring under the moon. To us it might sound fantastical, but to them it was as real as the soil beneath their feet. So what does this tell us? That medieval people, much like us today, carried an endless curiosity about the edges of experience. They wanted to numb their pain, yes, but also to touch the mysterious, to break free from the strict limits of their everyday world, even if just for a little while. And as you rest here now, drifting deeper into calm, think of them, the apothecary with his shelves of roots, the monk sipping a strange brew by candlelight, the villager lying back on a bed of straw, slipping into dreams colored by herbs and shadows. They were seekers, just like us. In the end, the story of getting high in medieval times isn't really about drugs or potions. It's about the human longing to escape, to dream, to feel more than the ordinary. And that longing is timeless, so as the candles of this story burn low, and the shutters of the medieval apothecary creak shut, let yourself wander too, into a gentler dream, a softer night, a sleep as deep as the centuries themselves.